Okay, good morning, everyone. Nice to see you here. Welcome to Monday of week 8, I think. Is it week 8? Let's see here. So Baha was here, although he was here before me, so hopefully he came back. Jimmy's here. Good morning, Jimmy. Casey's here. Good morning, Casey. Lil43, is that you, Lily, or is that someone else? Monica's here. Good morning, Monica. Banamer's here. Hello, Banamer. Mashid's here. Good morning, Mashid. Jenna, hello, Jenna. Hello, Thika. And Karen. Good morning, Karen. So we'll just wait another minute or so before people trickle in. What we'll do today is I have a good morning, Erica. We'll finish talking about this documentary, The T Word. We'll have a little break, and then I have a short article for you to read. It's an easy one to read, but it is connected with the T Word and with transgender people as well. Oh, you're Chan. That's you. I'm sorry. Okay, got it. Sorry about that. I was wondering because Lily's in the other class, but I was just wondering if she was hanging out in this class or not. Good morning, Caleb, and hello, Ivan. Okay, cool. Thank you. Sorry about that. Yeah, so we'll talk about the video. We'll take a break, and then I have a short article for you to read. Again, connected to some transgender issues, but we'll get to that in due course. Okay. Well, let's dive in. Okay. Let's jump into the first question I asked you here. So this was a question from Friday that we didn't answer, but I think that we could probably answer this question throughout the whole of the documentary. There's all kinds of things that are happening, and so how does socialization play a role in the lives of these people? How does the norms and values and beliefs that we learn in society, how does that influence their lives, the lives of these young transgender people? What do you think? What do you think? How do cultural beliefs and values and gender roles and ideas, how do they affect the lives of these young people? Okay. So Casey says, most of them are being judged for being transgender. Yeah, they are. They are being very strongly judged. And why do you think that is, Casey? Um, why do you think these people are judged and in some cases judged very harshly, or there's very, very strong feelings or reactions associated with the judgment of trans people? Why do you think that is? Karen says, it makes them feel insecure if they don't fit into a gender. Yeah, that's true, right? So here in the West, traditionally speaking, we've had two genders. We've had men and we've had women. And these young people, this is what's tricky, is trying to come to a societal agreement on where transgender people fit, right? And so if we take someone like Laverne Cox, who is the host of the documentary and producer of the documentary, do we see her as a woman or do we see her as a trans woman? Okay, so should we have two genders and Laverne should fit into the gender of women, or should we have different genders? So we have cis men and cis women and trans man and trans woman, and then we have four genders. Is that what we should have? Is that what we want to have in society? And again, because because in the West these issues are all fairly new, we've just started talking about them. I don't think we've quite figured out how things should be. And so right now we're leaving a place where we had two genders, but we're not really sure what will happen, or how we will kind of arrange society. So um, currently, yeah, there's some insecurity when these trans people, when they identify as men or identify as women, but if their bodies don't align with that, sometimes people can not accept them, right? And yeah, it makes you feel insecure. And I think we can probably all identify with that feeling of not being not being accepted, or being judged. Um, it's not really a it's not really an enjoyable feeling, right? And so these young people are feeling that, right? So Casey, so people are not used to those kind of changes, and so it makes them hard to accept it. Yeah, that's part of it, right? Particularly in the West, where um, no one was really coming out as transgender until very recently, and so for many people, this is still a new idea, and they don't know how to understand it. They don't know how to accept it. Um, and again, if you remember earlier on, this is a number of weeks ago now, but if you remember that diagram I showed you with the iceberg, the culture iceberg, and on the top there were um, kind of the very obvious expressions of culture, like music and food and dress and rituals and music and things like that. But then the further down you went, um, the more abstract the ideas became, but also the more powerful, emotionally powerful they became. And so, if you think about it, when we talk about transgender people, we are talking about ideas of gender, right? Like what it means to be a man and what it means to be a woman, and we're talking about aspects of sexuality, right? What society feels is normal and what society feels is not normal. And so those ideas are really, really deep in culture, right? They're very deep in a culture, and so people have a very strong emotional investment with them. And so when they are challenged, and we talked about this at the very beginning of the course, when people's ideas are challenged, when their socialization is challenged, often they will have an emotional reaction to it. And again, the deeper into culture you go, the more fundamental the ideas are, the stronger emotional reaction people will have. And so I think you're right, Casey. People are not used to encountering people who are different in this way. And people who are different in this way challenge very deeply held ideas about how the world is. And as we saw in the video, some of those ideas are religious as well, right? And so I think Kai's mom, if you remember from Friday, Kai was a basketball player, and Kai was talking to his mom over Skype or video chat, and she had a lot of trouble accepting him, and it sounded like part of that had to do with her religious beliefs, right? She sounded like she was a Christian, and so religion is also a deeply held belief, right? So yeah, so there is a lot of judgment, and that judgment is because people either don't understand how to interact with people who are transgender, or transgender people challenge those very deeply held ideas, okay? And yeah, and as a result, that makes them feel kind of insecure and uncomfortable, right? Because again, none of us want to feel judged, right? None of us want to feel like we're not accepted. What about this question here? I asked you, so this was from Friday, so hopefully you have something here, but how do some of these young people know their gender? And maybe more importantly, how do you know? So if you are a young man or a young woman or something else, But if you're a young man or young woman, how do you know that's what you are? Is it your physical body? Do you look at yourself and say, yeah, I guess that's who I am? Do you feel it inside? Do other people tell you who you are and then you believe them? Um, their interests. I might need a little more on that one, Karen. Give me a little bit more there. How do some of these people know? Yeah, so Casey says they just know it. They just know it in their heart and in their mind. Yeah, that's kind of what we saw, right? We saw that many of these young people, they're aware of something wrong. Well, I would say, Jimmy, not necessarily there was something wrong, but they realized that how they felt inside was not in alignment with the way people were seeing them, right? So people were seeing them as one thing, but on the inside they were like, no, that's wrong. You're not seeing me correctly, right? That's not who I am. Well, in some cases, no, right? Well, okay, that's true. In some cases, yes, right? So some parents were. That was something we saw in the video that was a bit of a mix, right? We saw some parents who were apparently very supportive, and then we saw parents who were kind of in the middle, and then we saw some parents who were less supportive, right? So if you remember Ari, so the young man from New York, the guitar player, the musician, Ari was kind of struggling with his gender identity, right? Because of course Ari was born a girl, right? His sex assigned at birth was female, but never felt like that's who he was, right? And he was really struggling. And he tells the story that his dad went on the internet and did some research and came back and said, hey, actually, I think this is what's going on with you, right? So in that case, Ari's dad was able to help him out, right? He was able to help him explain what he was feeling. And I think Zoe's mom was like that too, right? Zoe was the young woman who liked Pink, and we saw her just at the end getting that, talking about that leadership award that she got. She was, again, her mom kind of went on the internet and did some searching and found some uncomfortable things, but it helped her to figure out what was going on with Zoe, and then she could help support her, right? So yeah, parents can be actually very helpful in explaining what's going on, but also, and I'm not sure which way you meant this, Baha, so I'm gonna go both ways with it. But also, our parents do tell us what our gender is, right? And we've talked about that as well too. So when we're born and the doctor, when your mom gives birth to you and the doctor looks and says it's a boy or it's a girl, then our parents start to teach us how to be that gender, right? They teach us how to be boys, they teach us how to be girls, they teach us how to be young women, they teach us how to be young men, right? So our parents are part of that socialization process. They help us to be who we are. But in this case, it's very interesting because who someone appears to be on the outside may not actually be who they are on the inside, right? And so that's where things get a little bit confusing sometimes. But yeah, I think that's really interesting that these kids often seem to know from a very young age who they are, right? They know that either they know that they're a girl, or they are being perceived as a boy and they're being treated as a boy, but from a very young age they seem to know that no, this is all wrong, this is not who I am, right? And some people challenge that idea. Some people claim that these young people are confused, or they just don't understand, or it's a phase. And certainly there's a lot of confusion around this, but again, I ask you to look inside yourself, and if you identify yourself as a young man or a young woman, I ask you to think hard about how you know. Okay, how do you know you are who you are? And again, most of us kind of just know, right? We know that we know what our gender identity is. It comes from the inside. It's reinforced from the outside, but it comes from the inside. And so it's very interesting, I think, that these young people seem to have that feeling really from a very young age for most of them, which is interesting. Okay. Why is language important when talking to and when talking about transgender people? And so this was from Friday too. This was, I think, right before we ended the video. And Zoe, the young girl in pink there, Zoe, and Shane. Shane was the guy with the girlfriend. Can't remember his girlfriend's name now. Shane had the girlfriend, and both of them were talking about what types of words and pronouns are appropriate for them to use. And so how should they be addressed? What words should you use, or what words should you not use? That's what they were talking about. Okay, so it could be hurtful. Okay. Okay. Yes. Let me hear more. Let me hear more about that, though. Give me more, people. I want to be buried in live chat comments. I want to have so many that I can barely deal with them all. Come on. Hit me. Come on. I know you guys are fast typers. You're faster than me, so... Okay, so what does Karen have here? It makes them feel acknowledged and important when people use the respective pronouns. Using slurs is disrespectful and makes them believe like they don't belong. Yeah, so there's two parts to this, right? There's pronouns, and then there's also labels, right? And so people like Shane, for instance. Shane wants to be referred to as a guy. Shane wants to be referred to as he, right? Or his. And Zoe, of course, wants to be referred to as she and hers, right? So those pronouns are important. And when you talk about people who are transgender, that's kind of the appropriate way to say that or to discuss it, right? So I think Kai, the basketball player, he says, some people say transgendered with an ed on the end, and so it's like something has happened to them. They have been transgendered. But Kai points out, of course, you don't say that people are black-end, right? Nothing happened to Kai to make him black. He is black, right? You don't say black-end, you say black, right? And so he's saying he is transgender, not transgendered, because nothing happened to him. It's just who he is. And so those types of the language is important, right? So the hurtfulness, the discrimination, not to make them feel offended. Language is important, right? Because language is how we understand the world, right? And so the label that we put on something, even though some people might like to say, well, it's just a word, right? It's just a silly word. But words have a lot of power, right? Words define how we see things in society, right? Nasheed says here, because the way that people talk with them shows them how important they are in society. Yeah. And that's very important too, right? How we use language indicates if we accept other people or not, right? And we can very easily communicate to people that we accept them, or we can very easily communicate to people that we don't accept them. It's very easy to do with language. You don't have to do very much. You don't have to say anything super offensive or super you don't have to say anything super offensive or strong. You can very easily reject people. And I think Shane said that somebody at one point referred to him as an it, right? So not of one gender or the other, but just as an it, right? As a thing. And yeah, that's true, especially if you don't understand sign language. That's true, Sam. um, yeah, and so imagine imagine if we were in class, okay, and let's say um, I'm gonna pick on KC here for a minute. um, so so if we were in class and the first day of class, Casey says, "Hey, my name's Casey. That's what you should call me." And I look at Casey and I think, no, I think I'm going to call you Johnny. I think that's what I'd like to call you. I'm going to call you Johnny from now on. How's Casey going to feel about that, right? It's just a word, right? Johnny is just a word. It's just a name. There's nothing wrong with the name Johnny, right? It doesn't. It's not an offensive word, or it doesn't mean anything bad. But Casey will probably be upset with that if I call her Johnny, right? Because in doing so, in calling her Johnny, I am denying who she is, right? I'm denying her identity. She comes to me and she says, "Hey, I'm Casey. You can call me Casey." And I decide that no, I don't accept that. I'm going to call you what I want, right? I'm going to see you how I want to see you. I'm going to label you the way I want to label you, right? And so even though there's nothing wrong with the name Johnny, it's not her name, right? It's not Casey's name, and it's not how she wants to be seen and addressed, right? So even in just doing that, and I know that's a little ridiculous because most people don't do that, but in doing something like that, you are rejecting someone's identity, right? You're telling them, I don't accept you, right? And we can, so using proper language shows people that we accept them in society and in our group of people. But not doing it can also be quite hurtful, right? And so remember from Friday, remember how difficult it was for Kai when he was talking to his mom on video chat. And she has trouble referring to him as a guy. She will not call Kai her son. And so you saw how difficult that was for Kai, even though his mom is saying, I love you, you're my child, but his mom can't seem to accept him for who he is, right? His mom can't seem to say, I see you as a guy, I see you as my son. And so even though Kai's mom is expressing a lot of love for him, it's still hurtful, right? You can see that Kai is hurt by it because his mom isn't accepting of him, right? And so even though language seems, even though using, he or she or whatever, that seems like a minor thing, but in fact it's not, right? We can communicate a lot about whether we accept or reject people very easily with language, right? And so that's kind of what that's about. Oh yeah, speaking of Kai, so Kai, of course, was the basketball player. Um, Kai started out, of course, his sex assigned at birth was female. He played in a women's basketball league, um, but then he switched over, right, and he started playing men's basketball, and he identified himself as a man, as a transgender man, and so he kind of came out, if you will. He sort of expressed his gender identity within the world of sports, and after people already knew Kai as a female athlete, right? And so um, Kai was explaining that he was asked many questions about his gender identity rather than his athletic performance. And so, what was going on there? Why were people asking him so much about his gender? Because Kai pointed out that nobody asks Kobe or LeBron James about their gender. They just ask them about the sport, right? They just ask them about basketball. And so why was Kai getting questions not about basketball, but about Kai's gender, about Kai's sexuality, about whether he had a crush on his teammates? Why were those questions coming up rather than the sports questions, the basketball questions? So Karen says here, people still regard him as female, hence incompetent to compete in men's basketball. I'm not sure about the competence part. Maybe. He looked pretty good to me when we saw that footage of him playing. He looked like a good player to me. There's definitely some curiosity, right? And maybe some of that is okay, but part of it is probably this, right? Part of it is the idea that people were probably still seeing Kai as a woman, right? And part of that is probably okay too, right? If you get used to seeing someone in one way and then you find out something else about them, sometimes it takes a little while to kind of incorporate that new fact into your picture of that person. So some of that I think is okay too, right? I'm sure it was difficult for them to switch over and think of Kai as a man rather than a young woman. Yes, I think there was probably some curiosity. I think that's probably true. Baha says because he might be one of the few people who identify themselves to the public. That's true too, right? This is one of the things that makes it difficult to know how many transgender people are actually out there, because again, it's not entirely safe or comfortable for people to come out, right? And so undoubtedly there are more transgender individuals than we see and that we know about, but we just don't know how many more, because people aren't always comfortable identifying themselves, right? Do you know what I'm going for here when I point out the resume study? Do you know what my hint is there? Any guesses? Okay. So let me help you out here. Let me help you out here. One of the things we talked about in that resume study is the idea that is it job related? No, but good shot. Good shot. When we talked about the resumes, we said the idea behind the resumes was that when hiring managers were looking at resumes with stereotypically black sounding names at the top, suddenly a set of racial filters came down, right? So they started to view these. Yeah, we'll talk about that in a second, Casey. Um, so with the resumes, they started to see the resume through the sort of prejudicial and stereotypical ideas they had about black people, right? And so it's kind of the same thing here, is that when Kai identifies himself as a man, as a trans man, when he does that, suddenly these filters flip down, right? And so people don't see Kai as just a basketball player anymore. He is a transgender basketball player. And so that transgender part kind of takes over, and people start to interpret everything that Kai says and does through the lens of those stereotypes of what transgender people are. And we'll see that more kind of going forward with a couple of these other questions. But again, that one little piece of Kai's identity suddenly influences the way people see him. And so again, Kai was a basketball player, and actually a woman basketball player to begin with. And so that had a set of lenses of their own, right? And then Kai identified himself as a man, a transgender man, and then that influenced the way people saw him. And so again, there were there was probably some curiosity, but some of that curiosity went too far, right? Some people asked about Kai's anatomy in Kai's pants, and excuse me, that's nobody's business. Professional athletes don't get asked about their genitalia, and neither should amateur athletes, right? It's not part of the sport, and that was Kai's point, right? Is that, as reporters, you should be asking me questions about basketball, not about my, physical body and my gender, right? That's off limits, and it's off limits for cisgender athletes as well, and so it definitely should be off limits for trans. But again, people were a little bit curious. People didn't particularly know maybe what language to use and what things were appropriate and not appropriate. And so, yeah, he got asked some problematic questions. For this one, Casey, I think I'm going to hold on to that one for a later question, because skin color has something to do with what's going on here as well. Probably not so much for Kai, although the fact that he is black definitely influences his experience of society. But there are other places where I think it's more evident, but we'll get to that in a little bit. I'll tell you what, we're working hard here. Let's take a little break. We'll come back, and then we'll look at we'll look at the rest of the questions. Okay, so take a little break, come back very shortly, and we'll tie these up. Okay. Okay, people, and we're back. So, we were talking a little bit about how the greater public, I guess, interacts with transgender individuals, right? And so we said that there were some issues with using correct pronouns, and so if you're dealing with a transgender man, usually they want to be referred to as he, right? And if you're dealing with a trans female or a trans woman, trans woman, she wants to be referred to as she, right? But we said some people have trouble accepting these people, right? These people challenge their ideas about gender and about sexuality, and so they struggle to see these people as outside of the gender they were born into, or they struggle to see them as members of the gender that they would like to be in, right? And so we talked a little bit about why that is. We said that some people have, it conflicts with the ideas we have been socialized to believe, right? It conflicts with what we have been taught about gender and about what it is to be a man and what it is to be a woman, right? And so we went on to, they were talking to Ari, so the young man, the young musician they were speaking to, and he said that after he had transitioned, after he began living his life as a young man, some male students were uncomfortable with Ari being in the locker room, right? So, before gym class or before a sports team practice or game, Ari's in the locker room getting changed with all the other guys, but apparently some guys were uncomfortable. Why do you think that was? Why do you think some people might have been uncomfortable with Ari being there? Okay, so yeah, some people might still have viewed him as female, right? Which to some degree is kind of strange because I don't know about you, but to me, Ari looks like a very average young man, right? But you're probably right. You're probably right, Karen. There was a bit of that. Jimmy says because Ari is not really a boy and his or her appearances make them feel uncomfortable. Well, there's two parts to this. Jimmy. And so his appearance makes him feel uncomfortable. So there's a certain amount of personal there's some personal viewpoints here. I mean, to my eyes, I think Ari looks like an average young man. I don't, if he walked by me on the street, I wouldn't think anything of him. I would think, yep, there's a average young guy walking down the street. Again, not all of us might see him that way. That's kind of the way I see him. Now, the first question is very interesting, and it goes back to something that, or the first part of your statement here, Jimmy, goes back to something we were talking about on Friday, I think. And so the question is, who gets to say who you are? Okay, and so we brought up that question in when we talked about race, right? One of the first questions I asked you was, what race are you, and who gets to say, right? Who gets to say what race you are? And here, the question is, who gets to say what gender Ari is, right? Whose call is it? Is it his? Is it his parents? Is it society? Who gets to say who he is? In many ways, traditionally, it's kind of a doctor who gets to say, right? Because again, when a baby is born, the doctor looks at this little baby and says, it's a boy or it's a girl, and then usually parents just accept that and sort of go forward and start socializing their little baby as a little boy or a little girl. So in a way, the doctor is the one who gets to make the call. But after that, as people grow up, as they get older and develop, who gets to say who someone is? And you could even extend this question a bit further. You could also say, who gets to say who you are in all aspects, not just gender, but in terms of sexuality or religion or your personal beliefs and values or your hobbies or the things that you like, your personal characteristics, kind of like your personality. Who gets to say who you are? Is it you or is it other people? You don't have to answer that, but it's something to think about. I think this only for bullying because they were all changing in the same room. Why is it only him? Yeah. Well, they were that was definitely happening. I think Baha. I think they were definitely singling out Ari because he was different, and yeah, there's some bullying going on, and I suspect that all of the young people that we met in that video, and Laverne Cox included, all of them have been subjected to bullying at one time or another in their lives. I guarantee that. The locker room thing is interesting, and the reason I asked you about this is why do we have separate locker rooms? Okay, so this is my question for you. Why do we have separate locker rooms at all? Why don't people just go in and change, whether they're going to the pool or the gym or whatever? Why don't we just have a changing room where everybody goes in? Why do we have two separate change rooms? Why is that? Because I suspect that's probably, I know we come from different cultures and countries, but I suspect that's common to all of our countries and all of our cultures, is that there are, if you go to the pool, if you go to the sauna, if you go to the gym, if you go to play sports, there are two change rooms. Why is that? So Karen says to prevent sexual activity. Yes. You are absolutely right. I'm just going to see if anything else comes up here. But it's very true, right? We divide up locker rooms based on sexual activity, right? You don't want to be in the locker room and have, a bunch of guys staring at girls who are getting changed. And similarly, you don't want girls in the guys' locker room staring at them while they get changed. It's a little uncomfortable, right? Yeah, and in some cases there's a religious piece to that too, although you might disagree with me on this, Baha, but I suspect that if there's a religious difference, I think it probably has to do with the sexual activity thing. So I think even if a religion says no to this, I think you could trace it back, and it's because of the sexual activity thing. Yes, there is a privacy thing for sure. Yes, some people might be shy. That is definitely true, but I think you could probably trace all of those ideas back to the idea of sexual activity, right? That if you have two sexes or two genders in the same room, people might be looking at other people. It might be kind of uncomfortable and awkward, and so we generally separate out change rooms into men and women. But this is where it gets interesting. So the designation between locker rooms is not one based on sexual orientation, right? We don't have we don't divide them up according to a sexual orientation. We divide them up according to gender, right? So in doing so, when we go into the men's change room, the idea is that all the men in there are not interested in other men, right? That they're all heterosexual, and the women that they're interested in are in another change room. But of course, it's not true, right? We have homosexual men, we have gay men. And do gay men use another change room? No, they don't. Same thing with women, right? We have lesbian women, but they don't use another change room. They use the change room for women. And so we're dividing those things up based on sexuality, but we're assuming that everyone is heterosexual, right? Which they're not. And so this brings me back to, I'm just going to see what Baha says here. I'm not saying because Hindu have different beliefs, but their practices might, their practices might prohibit them from doing so. Definitely, that's definitely the case. But I want to bring you back to this, because why were some guys uncomfortable with Ari then? Because if we're concerned about sexual activity, if that's the thing that we're, if we feel weird about, and that's why we divide up men and women's change rooms, who is Ari interested in? Is he interested in other guys? No, right? He's not interested in other guys. We see that. We see that at Ari's birthday party, he's really excited for Rachel to come, right? And I think Ari talks about other girlfriends that he's had in the past too, but Ari's really excited for Rachel to come. He hopes Rachel comes, and when Rachel shows up, they kind of have a slightly awkward hug. But I think that's true, Karen. The guys are probably confusing gender and sexuality, and they're assuming that if you are a guy, then you like girls, and if you're a girl, that you like guys. And they're assuming that Ari is not a real guy, right? That he is somehow still a girl, right? And so there's a lot of things that are getting confused, right? And so when these guys are getting uncomfortable with Ari changing in the room, they're confusing sexual identity and gender, and they're not really accepting who Ari is. And so for Ari, his sex assigned at birth, which was female, doesn't matter in this way at all, because Ari identifies himself as a guy, and his sexual orientation and identity is straight, right? Ari is interested in girls. So when Ari goes into the guys' change room to get ready for gym class or whatever, he's not looking at other guys because he is not interested in them. And so that's really the change room that he should be in. But again, some people are, confusing. They think that Ari might be attracted to them, which he's not, right? Because he's interested in women, right? And so there's no danger of sexual activity happening here, right? Because Ari sees himself as a guy. Ari is heterosexual, right? He's interested in women. And the only issue here is that the other guys can't accept him for who he is, right? They struggle to see Ari as a young man, even though, again, walking down the street, Ari looks like a young man. I don't think any of us would take a second look at him, right? He doesn't, there's nothing really difficult, or not difficult, there's nothing really remarkable or different about him, right? He just looks like your average guy. And so that kind of brings us to this question here. I jumped a question, I know, but brings us to this question here. What is passing privilege? What is passing privilege? Did you catch that? What? Who talked about passing privilege? Shane talked about passing privilege. Shane was the young man with the girlfriend. Jessica, I think her name was. Yeah, so Shane and Jessica were seeing each other. So Shane talked about passing privilege, and I think, oh shoot, was her name Avery? Was Avery her name? Um, Karen says here, these are rights and treatments trans people who look like the gender they have transitioned to get. That's okay, Baha. It's fine to not know. But yeah, you're correct here, Karen. I would go a little. I would change it instead of rights. I think I would say that they are convincing enough in the gender that they want to express that people don't realize that they are trans men or trans women. Okay, and so again, Ari, for instance, and Shane, both of them can walk down the street. They are trans men, trans young men, but really nobody notices. Nobody thinks anything of them. They just think they look like your average guy, right? But of course, depending on the body you're born into, some people make more convincing men or women than others do. And so some people have less passing privilege, right? Some people, if you are a trans woman, but you happen to be a very large, super built trans woman, it's going to be a little more difficult for you to pass as a woman in society, right? The more your body is stereotypically male, the more people are going to look, right? And so people like Ari, people like Shane, they have passing privilege. They can kind of fool people into thinking that they are cisgender, right? Because they look enough like a typical guy that nobody notices. But again, that's not the situation for all trans people, right? Some trans people don't look particularly feminine or particularly masculine depending on who they are, right? And so people can when they don't look trans, they can become much safer. Yeah, so the more you can kind of blend into society, the more that the less sort of trouble that you may encounter, right? You could think of this, we'll talk about this later, but you could think about it with religious oppression and religious discrimination. Some people of particular religions and particular faiths are very visible in society, right? And so if you wear a turban, for instance, if you're a Sikh, if you wear a hijab, those are very, if you wear a kippah, if you're Jewish, those are very obvious symbols to society that is your religion, right? And so some people may encounter more discrimination because people can very clearly see what religion they belong to. But for other people, if you're a Buddhist, for instance, there might be no outward evidence of your faith, right? You might not wear anything that communicates to society that you're a Buddhist, and so you can kind of blend in. People don't really know that about you, right? And so yeah, that's very much the case here, is that people who have passing privilege, people who look more like, are able to make themselves look more like their gender identity, they kind of have less problems, right? But not always, right? Because again, walking down the street is one thing, but dating someone, getting into a relationship with someone is a different story, right? Because they are going to learn about you, they're going to learn who you are, and of course, if things become intimate, they're going to see your physical body, right? So that's a little bit trickier. And so um, we see Avery. We see that young woman who she's texting that guy. I think she might have met him through a dating app. She's texting that guy, and they talk about the challenges of dating when you're a trans person, right? And so Jimmy says here, many people do not like transgender people. Over in my opinion, I think transgender have not too much social interest. Well, I don't know about that. This is a tricky one, right? Because I'm going to grab Casey's here. Because most men would want to date a woman, a cis woman, and vice versa. Yeah, that was Shane's mom's comment, right? Karen says cis men want to date cis women and not trans women. Yeah, so that was Shane's mom's comment was exactly that, right? She said that, well, if straight men want to date women, and no, what did she say? Oh shoot. Oh yeah, she said if straight women want to date a man and gay women want to date women, then who is going to want to date Shane as a trans man? And so, I think his mom was worried for him, but probably was saying something hurtful as well at the same time. But that's kind of the common idea, right? Is that cis men want to date cis women and not trans women, and vice versa. The degree to which that's true is very difficult to establish, because again, there's still a lot of people who don't accept trans people. There's still a lot of confusion. There's still a lot of sort of prejudice and discrimination happening around that. And so it's kind of tough to know how people actually feel about this, because it's not sort of safe to talk about entirely yet. Casey, you're probably right here. I think it's probably fair to say that most cis men who are heterosexual would want to date a cis woman and not a trans woman, but that doesn't mean that all of them do. And so Laverne Cox, for instance, has had numerous boyfriends, right? We see in the video, of course, that Shane has a girlfriend, right? Even though Shane is a trans man. And I think toward the end of the video, they say that Avery has a boyfriend as well. And so even though this is probably mostly the case, it's probably the most common thing, it doesn't describe everyone. And so some people, some men, for instance, might only want to date a cis woman, but that doesn't say that all of them do, because again, we see that there are examples of people who it doesn't matter, right? For Jessica, who's the girlfriend of Shane, Jessica doesn't really care about, what genitalia that Shane has. She likes who Shane is as a person. She likes their relationship, and that's enough, right? She doesn't, the physical body part doesn't influence her one way or the other, right? And so again, lots of us might feel differently, but it's where's my question here? But it might be challenging, right? Because there are probably, if you're a trans woman like Avery, there's probably fewer men out there that want to date a trans woman, so she's going to have to look harder. There's fewer guys out there for her, and maybe this is the last thing I'll say for today. The other thing is that it can be dangerous, right? Some people might have, particularly men, I think, some men may have a very bad reaction to trans women. And again, this goes back to confusing ideas of gender and sexuality. Okay, and so when Avery is texting that guy that she met on the dating app, she says that, you know, she's going to tell him that she's a trans woman, but she doesn't want to do it in person, right? Because it's not safe. And I think the reason it's not safe is that, again, it confuses gender and sexuality, and it challenges people's beliefs about themselves, right? And so if a guy finds a girl attractive and he's really kind of into her, and then he finds out that, oh, she's a trans woman, then some guys can have a pretty strong reaction to that, right? Because they, for some reason, think that, oh, does that mean I'm gay, right? And so because there's so much, not so much, because there's still negative feelings around being gay, particularly for some guys, that can cause them to have a very strong and sometimes violent reaction, right? And so, and it shouldn't, because Avery is a woman. She is presenting herself as a woman, and so it wouldn't be strange, I don't think, for a guy to be attracted to her. That is a heterosexual relationship. She's a girl and he's a guy. But again, it's a little more complicated, right? And so you can see that dating for trans people, and particularly for trans women, can be difficult, probably very painful sometimes, and if they're not careful, they can actually, their physical safety can be put in danger, right? Because people may have a very strong reaction to the idea that they were attracted to a trans person when they didn't know that that person was a trans man or a trans woman. So yeah, it's complicated, right? Okay, so that is all the time we have for today. I meant to finish that a little bit sooner, but I guess it took us a little longer. Tomorrow I will give you a micropaper to start writing. I just have to finish the assignment and then I'll get it to you tomorrow, but I will do it tomorrow. But until then, we're kind of out of time. So good work today. Good answers in the live chat. Those of you who put them up, that was a good job. This is a tricky and complicated subject, but I think we're doing well. Yeah, so that's all I'll say. I'll see you tomorrow, or some of you I'll see you, in 10 minutes in comparative cultures. Okay, so bye.